There is a profound stillness in a man who has mastered the art of looking into the abyss without blinking. Sir Anthony Hopkins is a man of intense silence and legendary focus, a Welsh baker's son who became the intellectual spine of modern cinema. At 86 years old, he has moved through this industry like a ghost in the machine, witnessing the truth that the public was never allowed to see. Anthony Hopkins wasn't just an actor, he was a survivor. He fought his own battle with the bottle and won, but in doing so, he gained a unique perspective on the others, the ones who didn't just have demons, but became them. He saw how the power of the camera could feed a narcissism so deep it turned icons into something cold, manipulative, and genuinely dark. Today, that stillness is finally. We explore the 25 actors Anthony Hopkins faced who proved that beneath the shimmering light of the silver screen lay souls of terrifying complexity and chilling malice. There is a profound stillness in a man who has mastered the art of looking into the abyss without blinking. Sir Anthony Hopkins, Celebrity Count 1, is a man of intense silence and legendary focus, a Welsh baker's son who became the intellectual spine of modern cinema. At 86 years old, he has moved through the industry like a ghost in the machine, transitioning from the fierce, classically trained stages of London to the high-definition horror of Hollywood. He is a man who has looked into the eyes of everyone from the greatest poets to the most legendary monsters. And in those decades of observation, he has seen the truth that the public was never allowed to witness. Anthony Hopkins wasn't just an actor, he was a survivor. He fought his own battle with the bottle and won. But in doing so, he gained a unique perspective on the others, the ones who didn't just have demons, but became them. He saw how the power of the camera could feed a narcissism so deep it turned human beings into something cold, manipulative, and genuinely dark. Today, the stillness is broken. We explore the 25 icons Anthony Hopkins faced who proved that beneath the shimmering light of the silver screen lay souls of terrifying complexity and chilling malice. We begin with the man who was Hopkins' own mentor and greatest warning, Richard Burton, Celebrity Count 2. To the world, Burton was the voice of a god, but to a young Anthony Hopkins, he was a study in the destructive power of self-loathing turned outward. Burton was a man who possessed a talent that felt like a natural disaster, but he used that talent to intellectually bully and psychologically dismantle everyone in his path. Hopkins remembers the stories of Burton's scholarly cruelty, how he would use his immense intellect to find the specific point of failure in a co-star and press until they broke, all while maintaining a vodka-soaked, aristocratic disdain for the very medium that made him a king. He was a man who hated his own genius and sought to punish the world for worshipping it, leaving a legacy of shattered spirits in the wake of his beautiful, booming baritone. If Burton was a storm, Laurence Olivier, Celebrity Count 3, was a glacier, massive, beautiful, and chillingly indifferent to the lives he crushed. Sir Anthony, who famously understudied for Olivier at the National Theatre, saw the reality behind the lord of the stage. Olivier was a man who viewed his profession as a zero-sum game. For him to be great, others had to be small. He was known for a professional ruthlessness that bordered on the sadistic, particularly toward younger actors who displayed a more natural, emotional style. He would use his status to freeze out rivals and undermine the confidence of his own wife, Vivien Leigh, during her most vulnerable moment. Olivier had mastered the mechanics of acting but had discarded the empathy of the human heart, proving that the most respected names in history could also be the coldest architects of professional isolation. Marlon Brando, Celebrity Count 4, is often cited as the father of modern acting, but Hopkins remembers a man who had turned his genius into a tool for psychological siege. By the 1970s, Brando had become a figure of backstage dread, a man who felt the world was a stage that was beneath his dignity. He didn't just sabotage productions, he systematically tortured directors and co-stars by refusing to learn lines, demanding nonsensical changes, and creating an atmosphere of permanent low-level hostility. Brando possessed a terrifying capacity for casual cruelty, treating his fellow performers like insects to be observed rather than colleagues to be respected. He was a man who had found the top of the mountain and decided to spend his time there pushing everyone else off the edge. Faye Dunaway, Celebrity Count 5, represents the ice queen of the era, a woman whose extraordinary beauty was matched only by her reputation for calculated malice. Anthony Hopkins, moving through the high-stakes world of international cinema, saw how Dunaway used her talent as a psychological weapon. She was a woman who found comfort in conflict, often targeting the most vulnerable members of a film crew to exert her dominance. She would halt productions worth millions over the placement of a prop or the timing of a meal, taking a visible pleasure in the anxiety and fear she generated in others. Behind the sophisticated exterior was a mind that viewed the world through a lens of aggressive paranoia, proving that some stars don't just shine, they seek to blind everyone around them. Klaus Kinski, celebrity count 6, was a name that carried a physical weight of terror. While Hopkins maintained his professional composure, even he was shaken by the stories of Kinski's genuine unhinged madness. Kinski wasn't just difficult, he was a predator on set. He was known for physical violence, psychological terrorism, and an ego so vast it threatened to consume every production he touched. He possessed a total lack of human empathy, believing that his status as an artist gave him a license to abuse everyone in his orbit. He didn't play villains, he brought a very real, very present darkness into the lives of those forced to work with him, leaving a trail of trauma that lasted long after the camera stopped rolling. Burt Lancaster, celebrity count 7, was a man whose athletic grace masked a personality that was described by those who knew him as chillingly ruthless. Hopkins saw how Lancaster transitioned from the golden boy to a powerhouse who treated the industry like a battlefield. Lancaster possessed an immense intelligence, but he used it to manipulate and undermine any actor he perceived as a threat to his dominance. He was known for a smiling cruelty. He could dismantle a co-star's confidence with a quiet, devastating critique delivered with a grin. He demanded absolute loyalty, and would turn on anyone who didn't show him what he considered proper deference, proving that the most charming smiles can sometimes hide the most calculated hearts. Charles Bronson, celebrity count 8, was the man of silence, but Anthony Hopkins knew that silence was often a weapon of hostility. Bronson wasn't just private. He was frequently described as genuinely mean toward those he didn't respect. He carried the trauma of his youth as an excuse to be dismissive, and often cruel to younger actors and crew members. He was known to intentionally unsettle his co-stars by refusing to acknowledge their presence off camera, creating an atmosphere of cold tension that made the workday a grueling exercise in psychological endurance. Behind the weathered face was a man who seemed to loathe the very world that had made him a star, turning his celebrity into a fortress of bitter, unapproachable isolation. Joan Crawford, celebrity count 9, remains one of the most terrifying figures in the history of the business. While Hopkins entered the industry as her star was fading, he worked in the shadow of her reputation for professional cruelty. Crawford was a woman who had traded every ounce of her humanity for the image of the movie star. Her cruelty was systematic. She viewed every younger woman as a parasite to be exterminated. She was known to use her power to ensure that rivals were given poor lighting, bad costumes, or were simply written out of projects entirely. She lived in a state of permanent, high-definition paranoia, treating her own children and her fellow actors as props in a life that was one long, terrifyingly controlled performance. Frank Sinatra, celebrity count 10, was the chairman of the board. But Anthony Hopkins saw a man who ruled with the cold efficiency of a crime boss. Sinatra used fear as his primary currency. If he felt slighted, even by an imagined gesture, he didn't just argue, he sought to erase the offender from the industry. He was known to use his deep connections to blacklist performers and intimidate anyone who stood in his path. He possessed a dark, brooding intensity that could flip from charm to chilling menace in an instant. Behind the velvet voice was a man who possessed a capacity for cold, calculated malice that turned his inner circle into a minefield of anxiety and broken loyalties. Yul Brynner, celebrity count 11, was a man who truly believed he was born to rule. To the public, he was the commanding king of Siam, but Anthony Hopkins saw an autocratic ruler who never stepped out of character. Brynner didn't just play royalty, he demanded it from every person on set. He was known for a cold, impenetrable wall of silence that he would use to unsettle his co-stars, speaking only to issue commands or sharp critiques. He had a way of looking through people as if they were insignificant parts of the scenery, a psychological dismissal that could crush an actor's spirit in seconds. Hopkins remembers the stories of how Yule would demand absolute stillness and silence from the entire crew, creating an atmosphere of stifling fear that made filmmaking feel like a prison sentence. The shadows of the silver screen do not stop at the borders of the classical stage. They drift into every corner of the world, even the most beautiful ones. Alain Delon, Celebrity Count 12, represents a specific kind of European darkness. A man of such startling physical perfection that the world was willing to overlook a personality described as chillingly sociopathic. Anthony Hopkins, having navigated the global cinematic landscape of the 1970s, heard the stories of Delon's detached and often calculated cruelty. Delon wasn't just arrogant, he was cold, a star who seemed to lack the basic heat of human empathy. He was known for his involvement in dark underworld scandals and a total lack of remorse for the way he discarded both professional rivals and romantic partners. He walked through the industry not as a colleague, but as a predator who viewed kindness as a technical flaw. Hopkins remembers the reports of Delon's icy on-set demeanor, a man who used his beauty to lure people in, only to freeze them out with a clinical, terrifying indifference that left a trail of emotional wreckage across 2 continents. Then there was Bette Davis, Celebrity Count 13, a woman whose talent was as vast as her capacity for professional malice. While she is celebrated as a pioneer for women in film, Sir Anthony saw how she used her status as a blunt instrument to maintain her dominance. Her rivalries were not just for the gossip columns. They were systematic campaigns designed to humiliate anyone she perceived as a threat. She was known to use her legendary wit to cut CO stars down to the bone, often waiting until the cameras were about to roll to deliver a stinging personal insult intended to shatter a fellow actor's performance. She possessed a warrior spirit that had curdled into a bitter, unforgiving intolerance for anything less than total deference to her crown. Behind those famous eyes was a mind that viewed the industry as a zero-sum game, leaving a legacy of scorched earth and broken confidences in every studio she ever occupied. One of the most painful secrets Anthony Hopkins understands involves a man the world remembers as a joyful, athletic icon, Gene Kelly, Celebrity Count 14. To watch Gene Kelly was to watch the very definition of grace and effortless happiness, but the reality of his boot camp rehearsals was a nightmare of psychological and physical endurance that left his partners shattered. Kelly was a relentless, often cruel perfectionist who viewed his dancers as tools to be used until they broke. He was known to scream vile insults at his partners until they were reduced to tears, only to demand they keep dancing on bloody feet for the sake of a flawless frame. Hopkins recalls the stories of Kelly's cold, detached anger, a man who would not tolerate the slightest human error and who used physical and vocal intimidation as a primary means of direction. The joy we see in his films was a beautiful lie, manufactured out of an atmosphere of genuine misery and physical exhaustion. Milton Berle, Celebrity Count 15, known as Uncle Milty, was the first true superstar of the television age. But backstage, he was a figure of profound professional dread. Hopkins, entering the industry as the old guard was beginning to shift, saw a man who felt he owned the very airwaves themselves. Burley was notorious for professional bullying, often stealing material from younger comics and using his massive influence to bury anyone who didn't show him what he considered proper respect. He would humiliate writers in front of the entire crew and sabotage his guest segments to ensure he remained the absolute center of gravity. He was a man who craved the love of the public, but held nothing but contempt for the individuals who worked to make him look good. His lovable uncle persona was a thin veil for a deeply insecure and frequently malicious showman who treated people like expendable props in his own endless variety show. Rex Harrison, Celebrity Count 16, is a name that still carries a chill in certain theatrical circles. Known as the quintessential English gentleman, Harrison was a man of staggering arrogance and calculated coldness. Anthony Hopkins recalls the stories of Harrison's treatment of those he considered beneath him, which in his mind was almost everyone. He would often refuse to speak to crew members or younger actors, using his sharp tongue to humiliate performers during rehearsals if they failed to meet his impossible standards. He was notoriously indifferent to the suffering of others. Even in the face of personal tragedy among his colleagues, his reaction was often one of detached concern for his own schedule rather than grief. He had become so convinced of his own brilliance that he viewed the rest of humanity as mere set dressing in the grand production of his own life. A man whose polished exterior hid a heart that was described by those who worked with him as icy and unforgiving. Even the voices that brought the most comfort to a nation had their hidden discords. Bing Crosby, celebrity count, 17, was the father figure of America, a man whose smooth baritone seemed to calm the entire world. But Anthony Hopkins, and later Crosby's own children, revealed a man who was cold, clinical, and often cruelly disciplinarian. Backstage, the mellow Bing was a man of ironclad, often terrifying control. He was known to be distant and demanding, showing little of the warmth he projected to his millions of fans. He treated his family with a business-like detachment and his colleagues with a chilling lack of empathy that felt like a betrayal to those who grew up on his wholesome image. He was a man who had mastered the art of the facade, proving that the most comforting voices in history could sometimes belong to the coldest and most manipulative hearts, hidden behind a mask of Christmas cheer. Mickey Rooney, celebrity count, 18, was the ultimate child star who never truly learned how to exist in a world that stopped treating him like a prince. Anthony Hopkins watched as Rooney navigated his later career with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. He was notoriously abrasive, often shouting down directors and treating his fellow actors with a biting sarcasm that made any kind of creative collaboration impossible. He carried a deep, simmering resentment for the way the industry had changed, and he took that bitterness out on everyone he encountered. He was a man who had been told he was a legend since he was 5 years old, and he used that status as a weapon to make everyone else feel inferior. He spent his final decades in a cycle of professional conflict and personal turmoil. A man who had once had everything but ended up with a reputation for being one of the most difficult and vindictively cruel people in Hollywood. William Shatner, celebrity count, 19, represents a different kind of darkness, one of absolute all-consuming ego. While Hopkins moved through the industry with a quiet, observant confidence, he watched as the cast of Shatner's contemporaries struggled under the weight of his need for total dominance. Shatner was notorious for stealing lines, demanding that the cameras always be focused on him, and treating his fellow actors as if they were invisible background props. This wasn't just professional ambition, it was a systematic erasure of the people around him. He created an atmosphere of deep resentment and isolation on set, choosing to be the center of a lonely universe rather than part of an ensemble. He remains a symbol of how the desperate need for validation can turn a person into a black hole of narcissism that sucks the joy and the creativity out of everyone else's life. Errol Flynn, celebrity count, 20, emerges as a figure of terrifying dual existence. To the world, he was the ultimate swashbuckler, but Anthony Hopkins saw the wreckage Errol left in his wake. Flynn wasn't just a reckless partier. He was a man who possessed a predatory and nihilistic disregard for the lives of others, particularly the young women he lured into his orbit. He lived by a code of total, uncompromising selfishness, treating the people around him as fuel for his own self-destruction. He possessed a charm that was as dangerous as it was seductive, leading many into a cycle of ruin while he himself remained indifferent to the damage. Hopkins remembers him as a man who had completely surrendered to his worst impulses, leaving a trail of broken hearts and ruined reputations in a life that was less of a romantic adventure and more of a dark journey into unchecked appetite and professional decay.
Clark Gable, celebrity count, 21, was the king of Hollywood, but he ruled with a cold and often unforgiving hand.
To the public, he was the ultimate man's man, but Anthony Hopkins knew the reality of Gable's professional ruthlessness. Gable was known to be intensely competitive and could be cruelly dismissive of those he didn't consider useful to his career. He had a way of freezing people out, using his status to ensure that he was always the most important person in the room, regardless of who he had to step on to get there. Behind the famous mustache and the rakish grin was a man who viewed the world through the narrow lens of his own power, leaving a legacy of distant, often icy professional relationships that stood in stark contrast to his ruggedly charming screen persona. He was a man who understood the value of his image, but seemed to have forgotten the value of the human beings behind the camera. Jerry Lewis, celebrity count, 22, is a name that Hopkins associates with a specific kind of tragic and erratic brilliance. Lewis was a pioneer of comedy, but he possessed a dark, volatile streak that made him one of the most difficult men in the history of the. He was known for sudden, inexplicable shifts from manic affection to cold, biting cruelty. He treated his assistants and co-stars with a level of dismissiveness that bordered on the sadistic, often making them wait for hours just to satisfy a sudden whim. He used his fame as a license to be unmanageable, disrupting sets and alienating the very people who were trying to help him look his best. Behind the goofy kid act was a man who felt the world owed him everything, and who was willing to humiliate anyone to get his way. A man whose genius was matched only by his inability to find a shred of empathy for those around him. Shelley Winters, celebrity count 23, was an actress who used the method as a psychological weapon. While her talent was undeniable, her behavior on set was legendary for its draining and often abusive nature. Anthony Hopkins recalls the stories of how Winters would use her process to disrupt entire productions, screaming at co-stars and making impossible demands in the name of her art. She was known to be highly manipulative, playing colleagues against each other to create the tension she felt she needed for a scene, showing no regard for the actual human beings she was affecting. She was a woman who believed her talent gave her the right to be a professional nightmare, turning every project she worked on into a grueling marathon of her own ego, and a testament to the destructive power of a talent without a moral compass. Anthony Quinn, celebrity count 24, represents a man of immense physical and theatrical scale who refused to share the air. Hopkins remembers him as a performer who demanded absolute dominance in every frame. Quinn possessed an ego that was as large as the characters he played. He would use his physical size and his legendary status to intimidate younger actors into submission. He was known for alpha-dogging every set he walked onto, creating a hierarchy of fear where only he was allowed to be the center of attention. He treated the industry like a territory to be conquered, showing a chilling disregard for the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Behind the zest for life he projected on screen was a man whose primary motivation was the total eclipse of anyone who dared to stand in his light. A man who viewed other actors not as partners but as obstacles. Finally, we must look at Oliver Reed, celebrity count 25. If the era had a face of aggressive, unhinged chaos, it was his. Reed was the wild man of cinema, but beneath the hell-raising was a man whose behavior was frequently described as borderline sociopathic. He would pick fights with crew members, show up intoxicated and aggressive, and use his physical intensity to terrorize those around him. Anthony Hopkins, who always maintained a level-headed professionalism, watched as Reed turned movie sets into battlefields. Reed was a man who had completely lost the ability to distinguish between a performance and a provocation, turning his life into a slow-motion tragedy that forced everyone around him to become an unwilling spectator to his cruelty. He was a talent consumed by a darkness he refused to name, proving that the most dangerous roles are the ones we can never truly step out of. As Sir Anthony Hopkins looks back at these 25 names from the vantage point of his 86th year, he doesn't feel anger. He feels a profound, quiet exhaustion. He realizes now that the evil he saw wasn't always a choice, but a consequence of a system that rewards the ego and punishes the soul. He saw how fame acts like a magnifying glass, taking the tiny cracks in a human heart and expanding them until they become canyons. He saw how the industry takes the most talented among us and gives them the power to be monsters, and the permission to stay that way as long as the money is coming in. The true revelation of his long life in the light is the understanding that the brilliance we see on the silver screen is often a beautiful lie. It is a shimmering veil drawn over a reality of coldness, manipulation, and profound loneliness. These 25 icons gave us the dreams that defined our lives, but they lived in nightmares of their own making. They were the architects of our joy, but they were the casualties of their own brilliance. Anthony Hopkins' journey from that bakery in Wales to the heights of Hollywood was a path walked in silence and observation. He survived because he learned to see the monsters before they could see him. He survived because he chose to put down the bottle and pick up his humanity. And as he looks into the camera now, there is a deep, sorrowful wisdom in his eyes. He tells us these stories not to destroy the legends, but to remind us that the most important thing a person can be is not a star, but a human. He reminds us that the applause eventually fades, the lights eventually go down, and all that is left is the person you were when no one was watching. Let us remember the talent of these 25 souls, yes, but let us finally, truly, remember the cost. Let us look at those iconic faces and see the people who were lost in a darkness that no amount of fame could ever banish. The silence has been broken, the secrets are out, and the ghosts can finally rest. The golden age is gone, and the show is finally, truly over. Goodbye to the kings, the queens, and the monsters. The cameras have finally stopped rolling, and for the first time in 86 years, the stillness is not a mask. It is finally, peacefully, beautifully whole.